The Mesh Operations Kit is a new set of tools that you can add to Modo to expand your Modo toolbox. I created these tools to speed up my own workflow, and hopefully they can help to speed up yours. So I'll quickly walk you through them. The first step is always to create a new empty mesh item and to expand the Mesh Operations panel. Then if you click on Add Operator, once you have the kit installed, you should see that in the left-hand panel, there's a new category called ry_meshops, and this is where all the mesh operations for my kit will be found. So I'll go through them in order. I'm going to start with the first one, which is called Type Extrude. I'm going to double click to add that to my mesh op stack, and then I'm going to select the mesh op itself to access the controls. So with this mesh op, the first step is to enter some text. So I'm just going to write text, and then you have to define a font. So I'm going to click on the font field, and this is searchable. So I'm just going to search for Arial, and let's add Arial Black. And once you do that, the text should appear in the 3D viewport. So this is a very quick way to create all quad 3D extruded text without having to connect anything up manually. And of course, you have full control over all of the parameters. The next tool is called Curve Extrude, and this will convert a closed Modo curve to a 3D shape. So the first thing I need to do is to create a curve in an empty mesh layer. So I'm just going to select the regular curve tool, but any one of the curve tools will work. And I need to ensure that the curve is closed, and then I'll drop the curve tool. Then I'm going to create a second empty mesh layer, and I'm going to click on Add Operator, and in the RY Mesh Ops category, I'm going to double click on Curve Extrude to add that to the stack. And next, I simply need to connect this Curve Extrude Mesh Op to the curve that I just created. So I'm going to expand the Mesh Operator, expand the sources, click on Add Sources, make sure I go to the existing section, and I'm just going to double click on the mesh to add it. And you now have a fully procedural 3D shape defined by your curve, and of course you can change all the parameters to your heart's content, or indeed go back to the original curve, and if you select it in polygon mode, you can edit its shape and the 3D shape will update in real time. The next mesh op is called Spring, and this will give you a fully configurable spring primitive. So once again, create an empty mesh item and then click on Add Operator. And this time I'm going to double click on the spring to add that to my mesh ops panel. So at first the primitive looks like a tube, but if you select the spring assembly and just increase the width, you'll see that you now have a spring. And of course it's fully configurable. You can change any of the parameters. You can make it thicker or thinner. You can make it more twisty or less twisty. And you can also decide which axis you want it to be in, and you can flip it whichever axis it is in. The next tool is called Circle Extrude, and this will give you a fully configurable 3D circle primitive. So once again, I've created an empty mesh item. I'm going to click on Add Operator, and this time I'm going to double click on Circle Extrude to add that to the scene. And by default, the mesh operator creates this three-dimensional pie shape that you can see here. And if I select the mesh operator in the stack, then I have access to all the controls. So for example, I can change the radius of the circle, and I can control the sweep, so I can create a partial circle, or I can create a semicircle, or a complete circle. And if I have just a partial circle, I can control the rotation of the entire primitive. And I can control the axis and the extrusion. And if I want a negative extrusion, I simply just go into negative values, and you can see that it will then extrude on the other side of the work plane. The next tool creates a configurable curve-based arc. So once again, in an empty mesh item, I'm going to click on Add Operator, and I'll double click on the arc tool to add it to my scene. And I'll select the mesh operator to access the controls. Let's increase the radius. And I can have either an open arc shape like this one, or I can close it. I can also rotate the shape, and I can determine which axis I want it to be drawn in. And by altering the sweep amount, I can go from a small arc to a full circle. The next tool is a frame generator. And the way this works is that first you have to define size and position of your frame using a single polygon as a guide. So in an empty mesh item, I'm going to activate the cube tool, and I'm simply going to draw out a square or rectangular shape, and then I'm going to drop the cube tool, head over to the item list. I'm going to create a new empty mesh item, and then I'm going to hide my guide mesh. In my new empty mesh item, I'm going to click on Add Operator and I'm going to double click on Frame to add that to the stack. And then I simply need to connect my frame to my guide mesh. So I'm going to expand the frame mesh up, expand the sources, click on Add Sources. And then in the existing section, I'm going to select the mesh that I created earlier. And I now have a procedural frame which is based on that mesh. And of course, I can alter the parameters. So the default shape is quite simple, but you can of course make it more ornate with the additional controls. So I'll just play with these just to make the frame a little bit more elaborate. And you can see the shape changes as I start updating the settings. And I'll just make a couple more quick changes just to show you the options that are available. Let's just pull this out. You can also control the size of the overall beveling. And of course, if you make any changes to the guide mesh, so for example, if I select the top edge and decide to bring it up, you can see that the frame is going to update in real time. The next tool is a door frame generator. This works in a similar manner to the frame generator tool. So I'm just going to draw a guide mesh for my door frame, and then I'll drop the cube primitive and I'm going to create a new empty mesh item and I'll hide my guide mesh. Next, with the empty mesh item selected, I'm going to click on Add Operator and I'm going to double click on Door Frame to add that to the stack. And once again, this needs to be connected to the guide mesh. So I'm going to expand the mesh operator, expand the sources, click on Add Sources, go to Existing, double click on the mesh, and you can see that that creates the initial door frame shape. And I can control the width of my door frame using the controls. And if I want to enable additional beveling options, I can. And you can see that as I do this, the door frame becomes more ornate. And of course, I can change any of the values. And if I make any changes to the guide mesh, then the frame mesh is going to update in real time. The next tool is a tube tool, and the reason I built this is because I wanted an easy to use procedural equivalent of the destructive tube primitive tool. Now this tool requires a guide curve, so in an empty mesh item, if you draw a curve shape and then drop the curve tool, I'm then going to go to the item list and create a new mesh item. And then in that empty mesh item, I'm going to click on Add Operator and I'm going to double click on the tube to add it to the stack. And then of course I need to connect my mesh op with the curve. So I'm going to expand the tube tool, expand the curve section, click on Add Curve, go to Existing, and I'll double click to add the curve that I created earlier. And I now have a fully procedural tube tool and I can change any of the parameters. And of course I can return to the original curve. And if I select it in polygon mode, I can change the shape of the curve. In a similar vein to the tube tool, there's also a procedural hose tool. So I've created a guide curve and an empty mesh item. I'm going to click on Add Operator. And this time I'm going to add the hose. Let me expand it, expand the curve section, click on Add Curve to add the guide curve to the mesh. And the difference between this and the tube tool is that this creates a hollow hose instead of a solid tube. And as usual, you have several parameters that you can control. You can make the hose thicker if you want. You can also make the edges harder or softer depending on what you want. And you can of course always go back to the original curve and change its parameters. The next tool is called Quadify N-gons, and this is basically a quick and dirty way of creating a quad surface from an N-gon that you might have created, for example, with the pen tool. So let me show you how it works. In an empty mesh item, I'm going to select the pen tool and I'm just going to create a giant sort of N-gon from it and then drop the tool. Then I'll create a new empty mesh item. I'm going to hide the original mesh. I'll click on Add Operator and I'll double click on Quadify N-gon to add it to the stack. And as usual, I'll need to connect the mesh operator to the original mesh. So I'm going to expand the mesh op, expand the sources, click on Add Sources, and in Existing, I'm going to select my mesh. And I now have an all quad surface and I can control the density. And from here, I can either freeze the procedural mesh and just start doing traditional modeling on it, or just add additional mesh operators on top of this existing one. The final assembly creates procedural parquet flooring. So the way this works is first you need to define a room shape for the floor to reside in. It can be any size or shape of room, so I'm just going to use the pen tool to draw a slightly irregular room shape. Let's do something a bit like this and then drop the tool. Then I'll create a new empty mesh item. I'm going to hide the guide mesh, and in the empty mesh item I'll click on add operator and I'll double click on flooring to add that to the stack. Then I'll need to connect the mesh operator to the guide mesh, so I'll expand the floor assembly mesh op, expand the sources, click on add sources, and then go to existing and I'll select my guide mesh. And I now have a procedural parquet floor. I'm just going to hide the work plane just so I can see a bit more clearly. And I can change the parameters, so for example, let's make the boards longer, or I can make them wider. And if I want to, I can also change the direction that they're flowing in. And of course, if I make any changes to the size or shape of the room, the procedural geometry will update automatically. So as you can see, there's quite a wide range of tools in this kit, and hopefully you can find some tools in there that are going to be useful to you and your own personal workflow.